What inspired you to start GoGoDoc, and what were some of the problems that you were trying to solve in the healthcare industry?
So I started GoGoDoc about 5 years ago. And initially, I was an NHS GP, and I often found that a lot of the work I was doing was kind of the bare minimum. We weren't really pushing boundaries. We weren't investigating as I would like to. And what we thought was gold standard and deemed gold standard, often it's limited by population and having to spread that out across a lot of people. And I found in the private sector, there's when people are willing to pay for tests and investigations, there's a lot more wealth of knowledge in terms of healthcare that we can derive from individual patients. So, initially I started GoGoDoc because I really wanted to practice gold standard medicine, a gold standard medicine that is unrestricted by cost. It's kind of based on evidence base that I can see. And also I wanted to kind of practice bespoke care as opposed to a one size fits all model. I wanted to really tailor my advice, both with evidence base and things that are slightly more innovative, like functional medicine, like NAD+, like IV nutrition. These things aren't really thought of in the NHS. It's very much reactive, acute conditions, reacting to disease, whereas I wanted to practice more proactive health promotion, health prevention, and kind of preventing disease.
As the CEO of GoGoDoc, what are some of the biggest challenges you face in growing the business? I've written competitive market, but maybe it's not. I don't know. Do you think medtech's a competitive market in the UK?
Medtech is very competitive.
Sorry,
Medicine, medical clinics, medical GP,
Right,
pre-care,
for sure.
it's hugely price sensitive. SEO, PPC, the amount you have to, acquisition cost is so high that the margins become peanuts. So unless you're the clinician doing all the work, you're doing the brunt of the work, it's hard to make the ends meet. To pay someone else to do that work, indemnify them, it's just a headache. Building the business has been difficult just because acquisition cost is high, cost that a patient's willing to pay. Everyone's default is the NHS is there. Everyone's default is I can get this for free. Free, obviously you're paying your national insurance and your, everything you're paying. But, the default is I can always go to A&E. I can always go to my GP. But when that GP appointment becomes, 3 weeks to see someone, that's when people start to weigh up, is it really worth waiting 3 weeks and sacrificing my health? Or, if they require something more urgently, people tend to then think about the private sector. And then they become very price sensitive. And when people hear Harley Street, they automatically think, okay, we're going to be outpricing. We're going to outprice most of the population, but we try and make it as competitive as we can.
Yeah.
And we have great GPs. We ensure continuity. We ensure gold standard care. We really think about holistic medicine, not just the kind of the presentation that they come in with.
What are your recommendations for general practitioners who are looking to grow their practice?
I think skills are always king. If you can make sure that you have an area of expertise, an area where you feel you can really deliver kind of above and beyond most general practitioners, if you can pick up diplomas in child health, in geriatric care, in women's health, it all adds strings to the bow. Moreover, I think more and more people want to see personalities. And although it's kind of less spoken about when we interview people, we do want people who are able to engage with the public, engage with content, engage with social media. Less so is at the time where, you're happy to see whoever's available on the day. You want to see someone that you trust. You want to see someone, for example, for health screening, for medicals that you believe in. You want to see someone that you can relate to. So, having a social media presence would be useful. Not only us supplying you with patients, if you can bring your own patients in, that is another string to the bow that we would love.
As a CEO of GoGoDoc, what are some of the challenges that you face in growing the business in such a new market, which is the private medical sector?
One of the biggest challenges is our competitors. Our biggest competitor, obviously the NHS. With any healthcare brand, any healthcare business, you have to think about your pricing point, how you acquire your patients, what method you use, and is the demand there? And I would say over the past few years, the demand has definitely kind of trended upwards. And with emerging fields like, weight loss, with IV nutrition, with peptides, exactly. There's so much scope for a private clinician because, and, we never try and compete. We don't try and compete with the NHS. We'll always lose that fight. The NHS is an amazing service. It's robust, it's incredible. And, for the work it does, it's amazing. But we try and supplement, we try and add an extra layer of care. We try and add an extra layer of health and longevity and wellness for the patient. And it's that combination. I think we always try and communicate whatever we do with the NHS practice. And we ask patients to do the same. We always ask for their notes so we can know more about them. We think about holistic care. So if I'm seeing someone for a urine infection, I'm not just thinking about that. I'm thinking about who's in the home. We're making comprehensive assessments where we're trying to manage someone not just in that one acute setting, but kind of manage them throughout, the next few years.
What is longevity medicine? And for any doctors who are looking to get into that field, what would you recommend for them?
So longevity medicine is kind of focusing on someone's health span, not only their lifespan, not only how long they live for, but how many healthy years of life they have, and trying to extend that health span, in turn extending their lifespan. Part of that is kind of the traditional general practice, managing disease, but moreover, it's, screening, trying to optimize their health, and now with so many different tools, for example, health trackers, Whoop rings and Apple kind of watches where you can monitor everything. People are a lot more switched on to their sleep, to their heart rate, to their oxygen level, and being able to manage some of the things that are a bit more nuanced, that the NHS might struggle with because they're looking after the chronic conditions, trying to optimize someone's health to, reduce the risk of them declining and developing disease. Unfortunately, genetics sometimes wins every time, unfortunately. But we can sometimes delay certain conditions by optimizing health and health span and, making sure that people are screened and have the appropriate testing to make sure that they are optimized. Yeah, and if someone is looking to get into longevity medicine, there are courses. There's a diploma. There's also a master's course. I started by, informal research, just having a look online. I have done a course. It was a 1-year course on longevity medicine. And there's so many different rungs to that ladder. People will go into longevity is such a broad field that people often subspecialize in it, down the functional medicine line or the IB nutrition line or the weight loss less so. But, there's many different strings that you can go down.
So how do you see the future of the medical field evolving in the UK over the next 5 to 10 years? How is GoGoDoc trying to fit into that equation?
So already, people are moving towards regeneration, longevity, promotion, and really optimizing key risk factors. And I think with more and more science and more evidence that comes out, I think kind of the space in longevity would really grow. And GoGoDoc is well placed in that sector because we offer the services, often incredibly competitively priced. We are very good at what we do. We offer continuity, we offer expert advice, and we are linked up with some of the best clinics in London. So I feel that the next 5 to 10 years in medicine is definitely going to be towards the proactive health screening, seeing the same clinician again and again. Going back to some of the traditional values of GP. I know when my parents came to this country, they were saying, they always saw the same doctor again and again and again. And I think some of that has been broken down. More and more we're seeing different doctor every time, same day doctor. Sometimes we're seeing PAs or pharmacists, who are excellent, but that continuity is lost. Yeah. So I think, we are pushing forward in innovation, but I think we're also going to look back and have some more of the old school kind of continuity, seeing the same person again, someone getting to know you, know your care, know your family. I think that is also really important to people, especially in the UK who are used to that type of care. It's somewhat disjointed now. And I think private medicine allows for that continuity. It allows for that kind of relationship. And that is often, that helps health massively.
I think one question that I think the medical community would really appreciate, again, is so many doctors now fleeing the NHS, going to private practice. So whether it's GP or another one, I'm sure you've seen what your colleagues and stuff are especially doing. Right now, there are a ton of doctors I'm speaking to who are on the fence between, leaving the NHS job and going fully into private. What steps would you take to allow that transition for them to be seamless?
I think the first thing to be aware of is, or the first thing to reflect on is, why do you want to get into private care? Because it's not necessarily more remunerated. It won't necessarily be financially better, especially if you're relying on bringing your own patients in. The first few years, you're going to be hustling a lot, working really hard with some people that come back and see you, families that come back and see you, but it will take a while to build your trade and your business. So, it's a long-term game. You can't, it's unlikely you're going to be busy off the ground, off the bat starting, unless you sign up to a clinic that's going to provide you patients. But those patients are obviously with the clinic themselves. They're not your patients specifically. I would say, if I was starting out again in private medicine, I would really put in those early, those early hard yards. Think about what are the growing areas in medicine. think about what people are really looking for. For instance, the NHS waiting time for certain procedures. I know GPs that do non-invasive vasectomies, for example. So, if you have strings to the bow where you can do minor surgical procedures on the side and you can market that way and bring in patients through another stream, but then they become your private general practice patients. It's an amazing way to do it. I have another friend who's a GP who does endoscopies, flexible nasal endoscopies. So, if you can think about other kind of skills that you can add to your repertoire, it really does help both with employability and for patient retention.
Yeah, and that's actually brilliant. I didn't think about that. So be niche in something just to get the patient in your funnel, and then they become a private channel patient. That's so smart. I did that.
Completely. And at the end of the day, it's personality.
Yeah.
If you're able to speak to them, if you're able, some of being a private general practice is cutting through the bureaucracy, allowing someone to access someone else. For example, if I had a patient that needed a colonoscopy, I know I can get someone a colonoscopy this afternoon. You build a black book of connections, and not only do you give them work, they also punt work back to you. So there is a bit of back and forth, and inevitably the patient gets amazing care because the communication between me and the consultant is seamless. The care from surgery to scope to wound care, from start to finish, they're managed like an individual. There's no one size fits all. It's very much individual bespoke care. And you see the outcomes are so much better just because everyone is thinking about that patient and how to manage that patient best, which is sometimes lost in the NHS. So if you're looking to practice, gold standard care, amazing care, I think the private sector is a good place to work. And I would suggest initially off the bat, perhaps starting off with a company that's going to bring you some patients, building your skill set up, and just really getting yourself out there. I found social media. I've recently started my own social media page, and I found getting on social media, delivering posts, engaging with people outside of medicine and inside of medicine, that's been really useful as well. I built a decent client base just through influencing, you would say.
Yeah.
Although my reach is quite small still, already there is some traction there.
So you've mentioned that, you can either start your private practice, but maybe it's easier to work with a company that is already, that has a patient list. But if there's somebody who doesn't want to take that route and they want to go, start a private practice and transition away and not work for anybody else apart from themselves, what's the fastest way, a more strategic way to get patients through the door to their new private practice?
I think you always have to be mindful of acquisition cost. To acquire a patient can be incredibly expensive. The marketing outlay that goes in to get one patient is expensive. So if you do acquire that patient through marketing campaigns, it's important that you retain that patient, and it's important that you build a year of care around them. So they're not only seeing you for that one condition, you've given them enough confidence in you that they'll come back to you with their family. So that one acquisition should turn into at least 4 or 5. So there should always be a kind of a holistic, broader approach when you're seeing patients privately. To acquire that patient, I'd say there are lots of different options. If you didn't want to put too much money up front, for paid social or PPC campaigns or SEO or kind of a website, the unpaid way of doing it would be I would generally say, friends and family. I know it's not ideal, but, seeing friends and people that and people that, not people that but friends of people that just being out there, getting out there, your sphere of influence, making sure that people know that you're around, making sure that people know that you do private practice. I've done events at schools before. I've done education fairs at my daughter's primary school. I've been to my son's football matches, and I've turned up with stuff and I've done free blood pressure checks, free urine screening, checking for glucose in the, doing things for free, just putting yourself out there so people are aware you're around. And often you might get a home visit. When there's an unwell child over winter and they can't go to A&E for whatever reason, or the A&E wait time is very long, they'll remember that person came into my school. That person's a private GP and he lives down the road. So you might get a home visit out of it, or you might and then it builds traction. And if you're a good clinician, trusted, confident, and happy in your trade, it will spread.
What would you recommend for other practitioners who don't know where to start?
So I think the first place to start would be a decent website. You need a website because you need a landing page. You need somewhere for someone to go. And a good landing page, a good website that's clean, that says exactly what you do, that's price sensitive. From there, your back end, your SEO. So we need to think about blogs, blogs and vlogs, things that are on your website that will attract people. Generally, SEO is fairly inexpensive. If you're going down but it takes a while to build. So that kind of Google and kind of SEO takes a while to actually build traction. So you might not see that return for 6, 9, 12 months. And over that time, you need to continually blog, vlog, you to get out there. Paid social is another option. If you do social media, you can push certain ads and you can get in front of people's faces. But naturally, that doesn't really convert. The conversion rate from a social media campaign is very low. I've found the most expensive way, but it builds instant business, is PPC, pay-per-click. You pay Google to rank higher on the list of clinicians and doctors. You get instant connection with patients. But the issue is you turn it off and your bookings go to zero. And it can cost you £50 to acquire a telephone call, which you charge £55 for. So, if you're competing against Boots Online Doctor, if you're competing against other big players, they're happy to run at a loss. So how long can you run at a loss for? So I often say it's worth combining a bit of PPC to get you off the ground, to get some money, to get some people on the books. The SEO, the stuff on the background on the website should always be kind of updated and pumping. That should always be going. And that's often a slower burn of money. And paid social. If you don't want to pay for social, you can continue just to upload content on social media and naturally you'll get some traction, but it can take some time. So I'd say a combination of the three. If you have more money to burn, PPC, you get instant kind of connection. If you're looking more for the slow burn, but you don't want to put too much up front, I think a really good website and paid social and SEO.